We're now on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis, and just to reiterate, Abai is now, with his back against the wall because we now quoted a brisa that certainly indicates you're not allowed to create images of the celestial bodies like the sun and the moon. Whereas Abai said you're only prohibited lotasuriti if it's an exact duplicate. Abai lo asr Torah el bitmus arba ponim bahari hadod. I will, says Abaye, admit to you that this brisa that we quoted here expands the isolotasun iti to include making images that aren't exact duplicates, but only, says Abai, with regard to four faces. Now we're getting into Sefer Yechezkel. And Yechezkel HaNavi speaks about the Chayos HaKodesh, right, the holy angels up in Shamayim, and he describes that they had, each of them, four faces. This is what's called in the Gemara's language Maisa HaMerkava. There's a human face, a lion face, an ox face, and a nesher, whatever a nesher is. We translate nesher as an eagle, but I doubt if that's what it means. But anyway, so these are things that are meshamshim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu al moram, up in the shamayim. These are the chayos HaKodesh, the very high level of angels that, like they carry the chariot up to Kaviyachal himself. And that's what's prohibited, to create images. By the way, I was once in a major synagogue where I saw they had images of Chayos HaKodesh. I don't know. In any event, when God declares, my servants who serve before me on high, he with the capital H is referring specifically to an image of the holy Chayos HaKodesh. They are the bearers of the Kisei HaKavod. They're considered with me. Iti is the pasuk. So the Brisa is only prohibiting, claims Abaye, making an image of these four-headed creatures that have those four faces. Gemara attacks this. Elameata, according to you, Abaye, is parts of Adam Lechudei Tishrei? Are you saying that you're allowed to make an image of a human face that doesn't have the other three faces? Alama Tanya, what do we do with the Brisa? It says Kol partzufos mutaros chutz miparsum Adam. You can make faces of another animal, any animal, but not of a human being. And we're not talking about faces that have, not only human, but lion, ox, and nesher. And that's prohibited. So Abaye now is going to argue that there are two separate lavim in the Torah. Now, even though there's only one pasuk, but that pasuk can be read in two ways and generate two separate lavim. Rabbi Yehuda Beredi Rabbi Yeshua Mipirkei Rabbi Yeshua Shmieli. Right, I was attending the lecture of Rabbi Yeshua, and I learned the following: that lotasun iti, lotasun osi. So the way I understand this is the following: that Rabbi Yeshua taught that there are two ways of reading the word iti. If we read it with a chirik under the aleph, iti, then it refers to the four faces of the Chayos HaKodesh. And therefore we would come to the conclusion that to depict a human face would be permissible. But you can change the vocalization under the word iti, and from iti with a chirik under the aleph, you can change it to a cholam, which is osi. And osi refers to tselem elokim, and therefore human face qualifies as OC and therefore is included under this prohibition, which means that there's a specific biblical prohibition regarding depicting a human face. Aval shar shamosim shari. But other servants of God, other than the four faces of the Chayes HaKodesh, meaning the moon and the sun, then that would be mutter. And therefore Abaye is correct when he says that Ram Gamliel was justified in creating those depicted images of the moon, because the moon is not included in this lav of lotas and itu b'manavshach, whether you read it as iti or osi. So Gemara is still not happy. Ushar shamoshim mishari. And what about other servants of God, like the sun and the moon? That's permissible. For Tanya, we learned in another brayso, lotasun iti, lotasun kidmus shamoshi ham sham shalafani b'mara. Kigon. Okay, so now we have the four categories of angels: Ofanim, Srafim, Chayos HaKodesh, Malachi Ashares. I mean, if you want to learn the difference between these four categories, you have to study at great length the Rambam's opening section to his Mishnah Torah, which is called Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. And we always skip those two chapters in the Rambam because we don't know the difference between Ofanim and Chayos HaKodesh and so forth and so on. But the Brisa certainly expands our understanding of the Isser of Losas and Iti to include various celestial servants of God, not just the four faces. And therefore, the Gemara assumes in the Kasha that all celestial servants, including the sun and the moon, are now included, even though, again, the Brisa only mentions Alfanim, Srafim, Chayes HaKodesh, and Malachi Asharis. The Brisa doesn't mention of the moon. But the assumption is that once you took Lotasun Iti to refer to all the servants of God on high, then the Brisa would certainly include under that prohibition even depicting the sun and the moon. And we're back to square one. How could Rabbi Gamliel allow himself to depict the pictures of the moon? Amar Abaye, lo asri Torah el shamoshim shebimodar ha'elyon. Okay, so Abaye now comes back and he says that these four categories of angels, Srafim, Ofanim, Chayes HaKodesh, and Malachi Asharis, all belong to a certain madar. Okay, now, whatever translation you'll offer for the word madar, I can promise you it won't be correct. But apparently there are 7 madoros up in Shamayim. And for this, you really have to study Kabbalah in depth. And the highest one, which is called the Madar Elyon, it has many different names, and it's the highest firmament up in Shamayim. It has in it these 4 categories of angels. And that's what's called the Iti. So if you go, within the stratosphere, you get to the moon and the sun, that's not Iti. Iti has to be on the Madar HaElyon, the highest firmament up in Shamayim. So in other words, Abai is claiming that this Brisa didn't omit other servants of God like the sun and the moon by accident, but by deliberate decision. Focused only and limited the Isser of Iti to the Mishamshim b'Madar HaElyon. Frekti Gemara, are you telling me, Abai, therefore, that Sheb'Madar HaTachton Mishari, that you're allowed to depict the sun and the moon because they are in the firmament below? For Tanya, what about this Brisa? The Gemara is constantly pulling out Brises. I don't know from where. Asher Vashamayim. Right, so we really should read the whole pasuk. It says, "Lo tasil chapesel chal tmuna asher b'shamayim mimal ve'al v'asher ba'aretz mitochas v'asher b'mayim mitachas la'aretz." So it says here in this pasuk, and we can leave out the beginning of the pasuk, "Lo tasil chapesel chal tmuna asher b'shamayim," but it says b'shamayim mimal Vasher ba'aretz mitochas. Says the Brisa, what is this Asher Bashamayim referring to? I mean, if you're talking about the Madra Elyon, then that's Iti. Why did the Torah have to add Asher Bashamayim? L'Rabos comes to include in this prohibition Chama, Levana, Kolchavim, Umazolos. So we're down to the Madar Hatachton, right? The lower firmaments. Now, the Pasuk says not only Asher Bashamayim, but adds the word Mima'al, above. So that refers already to the Madar HaElyon, but the Asher Bashamayim, those two words, referring to the Madar HaTachton, the sun, the moon, and the stars. So Mimal is the Rabbos Malache Asharis. And he only mentions Malache Asharis because that's the lowest of the four categories of the Madar HaElyon. So the Gemara now has to defend Abaye by saying, Ki Tanya Hahili Ovdon. The pasuk there is not referring to creating images. The Torah is telling you what you're not allowed to worship. So the Torah is referring to the Maisa of Avodas Kolchavim. And if you create images of these heavenly bodies in the lower firmament of the Madar HaTachton, like the sun and the moon, and you go ahead and you worship them, you violate the Iser of Lotasa, etc., and worship it. Now, wait a second. Are you telling me that the only Iser to worship an image only applies to images of the sun and the moon and the celestial spheres? What if you create an image of a worm, a lowly worm? Eliovdam, if the Bryce is talking about prohibiting an actual mice of Avodah Zarah in worship, is afilu shilshul katan nami. If a person worships a tiny worm, that constitutes Avodas Kolchavim. So why do you limit it to the Madar HaTachton, to the sun and the moon? One says, Zanachinam Yoseifa Dekra Nafka Disanya. That now we're going to add another word in this pasuk and darshan it, which is another superficial word. And it says in the pasuk, if you remember, Vasher ba'oretz mitachas. And Sanya, we have a brayso, Asher ba'oretz, I'll add the word mitachas, lerabos, yamim nahoros horbugvos, and mitachas, it says Asher ba'oretz, which refers to worshiping images of anything that's down on this earth, like the seas and the rivers, mountains and hills. But mitachas, which is an extra word in the pasuk, l'rabos shilshul katan. Mitachas means it's on the lowest level. It's a tiny worm, and he made an image of a worm, and he worships the image of the worm. And that's included in this pasuk of lo tasa lecha, etc., etc. But now we're differentiating again between Asiya and Avoda. As far as Avoda is concerned, any image is included in Avoda, even the image of a lowly worm. But as far as Asiya is concerned, creating images, oh, no, no, no. Asiya only applies as a violation of the Madar HaTachta, the sun, the moon, and the stars, but not. Just one second. Let me backtrack on that. 1 second. I'm sorry. Let me say it better. Cross out what I just. The Brisa darshins these ribuyim, mitachas, and asher ba'aretz, and shamayim, and so forth and so on, as far as avodah is concerned, worshiping. And there we have, in that context, a ribui for the sun and the moon. But as far as asiya is concerned, creating these images, the prohibition of creating the images, as Abai insists, only applies to the Madar HaElyon, which is the four categories of angels. So the Gemara says, is that really so? Asiya, as far as creating images, is great dust. Great dust meaning without worshiping them. Mishari, are you allowed to create images of heavenly bodies like the sun and the moon according to Abaye? And the only images that you have enjoined from making are the Madra Elyon. For Asani, we learned to the Brisa, Lo Sasun Iti, another Brisa. As if we haven't had enough prices to barrage against Abaye. Lo Sasun Kidmus Shamoshai, Hamisham Shilafani Bamarim, Kigon Chamal Levana, Kochav Mozos. I mean, you can't be even more explicit here than this brisa that's outspoken about the fact that you're not allowed to create images of the constellations up in Shamayim. Then once again, we're back to square one. The kasha that Abai tried to defend Rabbi Gamliel for making these images of the moon. Shiny Rabbi Gamliel, Dacherim Asulo. Very strange. The Gemara wants to say the following. You're not allowed to create these images of the moon, but once they were created, you're allowed to benefit from them. So the Isser is only in creating them, but as long as they weren't worshipped, they don't have the status of Avodas Kochavim, which would be also by Noah. So what did Rabbi Gamliel do? He needed these images of the moon in order to teach the Eidim, what they have to testify about for the new moon. So he commissioned others to make these images for him. Now, I'm not sure who he commissioned over here. I mean, obviously, Lifnei Evil Osite Michshal, you're not allowed to ask another Jew to violate an Easter for you. It must be that he asked an idol worshiper. And now the question is, do we have a prohibition of Lifnei Iver by commissioning a guy to create images that the guy himself would worship? But the answer is, I believe, that it's Trey Ibra Denari, it's two sides of a river, meaning the guy could, he doesn't need your commission to create these images. He could do it on his own. The only problem is that Midrabanan is Lifnei Iver, even in Trey Ibra Denari. So apparently, for the sake of the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, they were matir, the Chacham were matir, this Isa D'Rabbanan. Frek the Gemara Vaha, Rabbi Yehuda, the Acherim Asulo, V'yomer le Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda, Shinina Sami Eni Deden. In other words, Shmuel objected to the fact that Rabbi Yehuda had commissioned idol worshippers to create a ring, a signet ring for him, that apparently had some sort of an image on it. He says the image on the ring was apparently that of a human face, and we're not allowed to we're enjoined from engraving the image of a human face on a ring, but we can ask a guy to do it for us, like you'd be able to buy it in the market. That's what Rabbi Yehuda seemed to assume, and Shmuel argued against him. He called him the sharp one, blind this one's eyes, meaning he did not accept that a Jew could even benefit from the creation of Avodah Zara of an idol worship. And therefore, how could you, Rabbi Yehuda, allow a guy to create a signet ring that had the image of a human face on it? And by analogy, how could Rabbi Gamliel allow a guy to create an image of the moon, and then Rabbi Gamliel would keep this image in his house, up in his attic, in order to, etc.? You're not allowed to do that because Shmuel rejected it. So Gemara says, Hassam, no, Shmuel only rejected in the case of Rabbi Yehuda's signet ring. Bechosamo bolet. Because now the Gemara is introducing a whole new element into the equation, and that is that the image of a face impacted in a ring, a signet ring, protrudes. It's like a bust. You see in a museum a bust. It protrudes. As opposed to the image of a moon on a flat surface, which is two-dimensional, which is not three-dimensional. Now, exactly how they created this image on the seal of a signet ring, they carved out the surrounding metal so that the metal formed a raised image. And that's called in modern technology, how do you say tachrit? Just one second in English. An, a There's another word before etching. What's it called? Just give me a second. Okay, I don't remember the word right now, but it's a kind of a type of an etching. And what they do is they flatten the surface level so that the image protrudes upwards. And they create like a mold, and then from that mold they could recreate the same, the same piece of art, the same picture over and over and over again. Oh, it's called what kind of an etching? Okay, it's an etching. Anyway, so that's called mishum chashoda. So we'll try to understand what the word chashoda means. Literally, it means suspicion. It means lifnei. It means visem nekim lifnei Hashem elkeichem, or marasayin. The Sanya we learned to the Brisa tabas shechosomo bolet. So the image on the signet ring protrudes outwards. It is osur lanicha, right? You're not allowed to place it on your finger, and you're not allowed to benefit from it. When people see the protruding image on the signet, assuming it's an image of a face, of a human face, they suspect that maybe he's worshiping it, and that's prohibited. So that's why Shmuel was objecting to Rabbi Yehuda in terms of the signet ring that he commissioned the guy to make for him because it was protruding. However, even though the Brisa says you're not allowed to wear this ring, nevertheless, mutar lachtom ba. Once the ring was created and it could use as a stamp, which is like a signature, then that's permitted. And the reason for that apparently is because when you sign something with that signet ring, although the ring itself has a protruding image on it, but that which you sign is on flat level. It's not protruding. Chosama shokea. Now, let's say you have a different kind of signet ring where they created something and then they depressed the image, in this case of a face. Mutalanicha. In such a case, you're allowed to wear the ring on the finger because no one would suspect you of worshiping such a depressed signet. But also lachtomba. But on the other hand, the exact opposite, you're not allowed to use it to sign because these rings were made out of wax and it created a protruding image on the page that you signed. How far are you going with this? I mean, are you going to tell me that anytime let's say, for example, we put up the Gemara is going to talk about a statue of a king, so you're going to say, well, wait a minute, maybe this chashoda, people are going to suspect us of worshiping that statue. The famous synagogue in Narda, Ukma Be'andarta, they had a statue of the king. None of the great Amoraim of that generation had any inhibition or any hesitation about praying inside that synagogue, even though there was a statue of the king right outside the synagogue. So apparently they didn't object to it. So what about chashoda? Chashoda means maris ayin. People might suspect, like in the case of the ring, since it's protruding, they might think that you worshipped it, and therefore you can't use this ring. And now we should say you cannot put up a statue of a king because people might suspect that you intend to worship that statue. They used to worship the statues of kings, as we mentioned a few blot ago. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Shaidi, when do we say that there's chashoda? That's only for an individual. But when you talk about something that was established for the sake of the community, nobody's going to believe that the community itself was schlepped into Avoda Zara and they're going to worship the statue of the king. So Gemara now says, Ram Gamliel, the Yochid Havi, you're telling me that there's no chashoda, and therefore if you have the image of a moon, then although there's a prohibition against worshiping it, we're not going to suspect that he worships it. We just finished establishing that in the case of a yochid, we are suspicious. We have to worry about chashoda. Rav Gamliel was a yochid. How can he put up these images of the moon? There's an Isser of chashoda. Again, even though no one would presumably suspect Rav Gamliel of worshiping the image of a moon, but nevertheless, the Isser is an Isser that applies universally to every person. And the Gemara answers no. There are certain individuals that have a special status in halacha. We call it a chal shem begavra. Kevin the Nasi, who he was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, and therefore shchichei Rabbim Kabeh. He represents the entire tzibur of the Rabbin, and therefore, since we said there's no chashoda regarding the Rabbin, there's no chashoda regarding the Nasi of the Rabbin. Another answer the Gemara offers: Ibois Ema Diprakim Havoy. When are you enjoined from creating an image of the moon? That's when you create one complete image that has no sections to it. But Rabbi Gamliel's images, the Gemara is suggesting, were made up of different pieces, different segments that were sort of glued together to form an image of the moon. Another answer, finally the Gemara gives my answer that I said a half hour ago, that if you are using these images for whatever purpose, people might suspect that you would worship these images as the idolaters did. But if you're doing it for the sake of teaching, then quite clearly no one would ever suspect that you're worshiping it. You did it for the sake of teaching the witnesses how to identify the new moon. Desanya, we learned this principle in a brisa. It says Lo Silmad Lasos. Okay, we have to get the context there. Anyway, it says that with regard to kishuf, the Torah prohibits kishuf and prohibits any sort of attending a sorcery school. I guess they had sorcery schools in those days. And the Gemara's Medayik, the Brisa says, but if you want to teach the laws of Kishuf and tell the people what is prohibited, what is not, then you could. That's why the Gemara is going to tell us that Avraham Avinu had many Masechtes of Avodah Zarah. We only have one. He had many, because he was the Baki in Avodah Zarah. And why was it permissible for him? Because he would teach the people, not to do the following or not to be schlepped into Avodah Zarah. Rav Shem Gamliel Omer, at the end of the Mishnah, Rav Shem Gamliel says that if you have figures of the sun, the moon, or a dragon, or something that's engraved on utensils that are dignified, that's prohibited. What's considered a dignified utensil? The Ezehei Mevuzim, and what is a regular common utensil? Amarav Mechubadim Lamalam in Amayim. Mevuzim Lamatim in Amayim. So it all depends upon whether it's above water level or below water level. A utensil with depictions on its rim, right? The water in the utensil goes up to the rim, and he put depictions on top of the rim. That's called dignified. That was made for purposes of idol worship. But a utensil with depictions on the walls of the utensil or the bottom of the utensil that were flooded with the liquids that were in the utensil, that's not dignified. That's considered mavuzim, and therefore it's mutter. Shmuel Amar, elu v'elu mavuzin hem. Even the depictions around the rim of the utensils above the water level are considered mavuzim. But what's considered dignified? You got to go a step further. Elu ela elu hein mechubadim shal ashirin va'al hanezomim v'al tabos. When you put these images on various expensive ornaments like bracelets, nose rings, finger rings, in all those cases, since these articles are usually made for ornamentation, they are considered dignified. And therefore, we have to suspect that maybe, according to they would worship them. Tanya Kavasi de Shmuel, this last opinion of Shmuel is supported by a brisa that says, Mechubadim shal ashirin v'al nizomim v'al tabos, mevuzin shal yoros v'al kumkumosim v'al mechame chamin v'she'el asadinim v'al mitpachos. So if you have depictions on pots or kettles or these mecham, these they use to warm them up water, or on sheets or on matpachos, different kinds of things, kerchiefs and so forth that are used to blow your nose, or towels to use to dry the face. In all those cases, those are considered mavuzim, and therefore we don't suspect that they were utensils that we used for Avoda Zara. So we'll finish the Amud, and I apologize, we went a little overtime with this Mishnah very quickly. Rabbi Yossi Omer Shochek v'zor l'ruach o matil yam. When you have something, a metal idol that was worshipped, and Rabbi Yossi says you have to cast it into the Dead Sea, into Yam HaMelech. First, he says you have to grind it up, then scatter it to the wind, or alternatively, you can cast it into the Yam HaMelech. Now, there are two ways of reading this Mishnah. I'll just mention them. A big machlokas rishonim. When it says "o matil yam," it means that after you grind it up, you have two options. You could either throw it into the wind, or you can throw it into the sea, but it has to be ground first. Amru lo, the Chachamim say, af hu nases zevel. You could also grind it up and use it as fertilizer because it lost its status as avodah zarah. And the proof is shenemar lo yidbak v'yodchem me'uma min acherem, right? And what's me'uma min acherem? Apparently, me'uma min acherem means that you're not allowed to benefit from the idol, but once you have ground the idol into a powder, then it's not considered as if you benefited from the idol. So Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim are arguing about the issue of zev zeg gorim, which means where the product combination of permitted and forbidden factors itself is permitted or forbidden. So the powder of the pulverized idol will inevitably combine with other nurturing factors like soil, water, and other fertilizers to yield a crop. Rabbi Yossi holds that since one would not be able to benefit exclusively from the pulverized idol, therefore the fruit is permitted after the fact. However, l'chatchila, he is not allowed to fertilize the field with the idolatrous powder, but the Chachamim say that even such a benefit is prohibited here because zev zeg gorem is also, and we're up to the Gemara Tanya, which Amir Hashem will pick up tomorrow, hopefully at 9:30. Have a great day.